of Human Bondage by W. Somerset Maugham. Chapter 105. The wages were paid once a month by the secretary. On pay day each batch of assistants, coming down from tea, went into the passage and joined the long line of people waiting orderly like the audience in a queue outside a gallery door. One by one they entered the office. The secretary sat at a desk with wooden bowls of money in front of him, and he asked the employee's name. He referred to a book quickly, after a suspicious glance at the assistants, said aloud the sum due, and taking money out of the bowl, counted it into his hand. "Thank you," he said. "Next?" "Thank you," was the reply. The assistant passed on to the second secretary, and before leaving the room paid him 4 shillings for washing money, 2 shillings for the club, and any fines that he might have incurred. With what he had left, he went back into his department, and there waited till it was time to go. Most of the men in Philip's house were in debt with the woman who sold the sandwiches they generally ate for supper. She was a funny old thing, very fat, with a broad red face, and black hair plastered neatly on each side of the forehead in the fashion shown in early pictures of Queen Victoria. She always wore a little black bonnet and a white apron. Her sleeves were tucked up to the elbow. She cut the sandwiches with large, dirty, greasy hands, and there was grease on her bodice, grease on her apron, grease on her skirt. She was called Mrs. Fletcher, but everyone addressed her as Ma. She was really fond of the shop assistants, whom she called her boys. She never minded giving credit towards the end of the month, and it was known that now and then she had lent some one or other a few shillings when he was in straits. She was a good woman. When they were leaving, or when they came back from the holidays, the boys kissed her fat red cheek, and more than one, dismissed and unable to find another job, had got for nothing food to keep body and soul together. The boys were sensible of her large heart and repaid her with genuine affection. There was a story they liked to tell of a man who had done well for himself at Bradford, and had 5 shops of his own, and had come back after 15 years and visited Ma Fletcher and given her a gold watch. Philip found himself with 18 shillings left out of his month's pay. It was the first money he had ever earned in his life. It gave him none of the pride which might have been expected, but merely a feeling of dismay. The smallness of the sum emphasized the hopelessness of his position. He took 15 shillings to Mrs. Athelny to pay back part of what he owed her, but she would not take more than half a sovereign. "Do you know, at that rate it'll take me 8 months to settle up with you." "As long as Athelny's in work I can afford to wait, and who knows, p'raps they'll give you a rise." Athelny kept on saying that he would speak to the manager about Philip. It was absurd that no use should be made of his talents. But he did nothing, and Philip soon came to the conclusion that the press agent was not a person of so much importance in the manager's eyes as in his own. Occasionally he saw Athelny in the shop. His flamboyance was extinguished, and in neat, commonplace, shabby clothes he hurried, a subdued, unassuming little man, through the departments as though anxious to escape notice. "When I think of how I'm wasted there," he said at home, "I'm almost tempted to give in my notice. There's no scope for a man like me. I'm stunted. I'm starved." Mrs. Athelny, quietly sewing, took no notice of his complaints. Her mouth tightened a little. "It's very hard to get jobs in these times. It's regular and it's safe. I expect you'll stay there as long as you give satisfaction." It was evident that Athelny would. It was interesting to see the ascendancy which the uneducated woman, bound to him by no legal tie, had acquired over the brilliant, unstable man. Mrs. Athelny treated Philip with motherly kindness now that he was in a different position, and he was touched by her anxiety that he should make a good meal. It was the solace of his life, and when he grew used to it, the monotony of it was what chiefly appalled him, that he could go every Sunday to that friendly house. It was a joy to sit in the stately Spanish chairs and discuss all manner of things with Athelny. Though his condition seemed so desperate, he never left him to go back to Harrington Street, without a feeling of exultation. At first Philip, in order not to forget what he had learned, tried to go on reading his medical books, but he found it useless. He could not fix his attention on them after the exhausting work of the day, and it seemed hopeless to continue working when he did not know in how long he would be able to go back to the hospital. He dreamed constantly that he was in the wards. The awakening was painful. The sensation of other people sleeping in the room was inexpressibly irksome to him. He had been used to solitude, and to be with others always, never to be by himself for an instant, was at these moments horrible to him. It was then that he found it most difficult to combat his despair. He saw himself going on with that life, first to the right, second on the left, madam, indefinitely, and having to be thankful if he was not sent away. The men who had gone to the war would be coming home soon. The firm had guaranteed to take them back, and this must mean that others would be sacked. He would have to stir himself even to keep the wretched post he had. There was only one thing to free him, and that was the death of his uncle. He would get a few £100 then, and on this he could finish his course at the hospital. Philip began to wish with all his might for the old man's death. He reckoned out how long he could possibly live. He was well over 70. Philip did not know his exact age, but he must be at least 75. He suffered from chronic bronchitis, and every winter had a bad cough. Though he knew them by heart, Philip read over and over again the details in his textbook of medicine of chronic bronchitis in the old. A severe winter might be too much for the old man. With all his heart Philip longed for cold and rain. He thought of it constantly, so that it became a monomania. Uncle William was affected by the great heat too, and in August they had had 3 weeks of sweltering weather. Philip imagined to himself that one day perhaps a telegram would come saying that the vicar had died suddenly, and he pictured to himself his unutterable relief. As he stood at the top of the stairs and directed people to the departments they wanted, he occupied his mind with thinking incessantly what he would do with the money. He did not know how much it would be, perhaps no more than £500, but even that would be enough. He would leave the shop at once. He would not bother to give notice. He would pack his box and go without saying a word to anybody. And then he would return to the hospital. That was the first thing. Would he have forgotten much? In 6 months he could get it all back, and then he would take his 3 examinations as soon as he could. Midwifery first, then medicine and surgery. The awful fear seized him that his uncle, notwithstanding his promises, might leave everything he had to the parish or the church. The thought made Philip sick. He could not be so cruel. But if that happened, Philip was quite determined what to do. He would not go on in that way indefinitely. His life was only tolerable because he could look forward to something better. If he had no hope, he would have no fear. The only brave thing to do then would be to commit suicide. And thinking this over too, Philip decided minutely what painless drug he would take, and how he would get hold of it. It encouraged him to think that if things became unendurable, he had at all events a way out. Second to the right, madam, and down the stairs. First on the left and straight through. Mr. Phillips, forward, please. Once a month for a week Philip was on duty. He had to go to the department at 7 in the morning and keep an eye on the sweepers. When they finished he had to take the sheets off the cases and the models. Then in the evening when the assistants left he had to put back the sheets on the models and the cases and gang the sweepers again. It was a dusty, dirty job. He was not allowed to read or write or smoke, but just had to walk about, and the time hung heavily on his hands. When he went off at 9:30 he had supper given him, and this was the only consolation. For tea at 5 o'clock had left him with a healthy appetite, and the bread and cheese, the abundant cocoa which the firm provided, were welcome. One day, when Philip had been at Lynn's for 3 months, Mr. Sampson, the buyer, came into the department fuming with anger. The manager, happening to notice the costume window as he came in, had sent for the buyer and made satirical remarks upon the color scheme. Forced to submit in silence to his superior's sarcasm, Mr. Sampson took it out of the assistants, and he rated the wretched fellow whose duty it was to dress the window. "If you want a thing well done, you must do it yourself," Mr. Sampson stormed. "I've always said it, and I always shall. One can't leave anything to you chaps. Intelligent, you call yourselves, do you? Intelligent!" He threw the word at the assistants as though it were the bitterest term of reproach. "Don't you know that if you put an electric blue in the window it'll kill all the other blues?" He looked round the department ferociously, and his eye fell upon Philip. "You'll dress the window next Friday, Carey. Let's see what you can make of it." He went into his office, muttering angrily. Philip's heart sank. When Friday morning came, he went into the window with a sickening sense of shame. His cheeks were burning. It was horrible to display himself to the passers-by, and though he told himself it was foolish to give way to such a feeling, he turned his back to the street. There was not much chance that any of the students at the hospital would pass along Oxford Street at that hour, and he knew hardly anyone else in London. But as Philip worked with a huge lump in his throat, he fancied that on turning round he would catch the eye of some man he knew. He made all the haste he could. By the simple observation that all reds went together, and by spacing the costumes more than was usual, Philip got a very good effect, and when the buyer went into the street to look at the result, he was obviously pleased. "I knew I shouldn't go far wrong in putting you on the window. The fact is, you and me are gentlemen. Mind you, I wouldn't say this in the department, but you and me are gentlemen, and that always tells. It's no good your telling me it doesn't tell, because I know it does tell." Philip was put on the job regularly, but he could not accustom himself to the publicity, and he dreaded Friday morning, on which the window was dressed, with a terror that made him awake at 5 o'clock and lie sleepless with sickness in his heart. The girls in the department noticed his shamefaced way, and they very soon discovered his trick of standing with his back to the street. They laughed at him and called him sidey. "I suppose you're afraid your aunt'll come along and cut you out of her will." On the whole, he got on well enough with the girls. They thought him a little queer, but his clubfoot seemed to excuse his not being like the rest, and they found in due course that he was good-natured. He never minded helping anyone, and he was polite and even-tempered. "You can see he's a gentleman," they said. "Very reserved, isn't he?" said one young woman, to whose passionate enthusiasm for the theatre he had listened unmoved. Most of them had fellers, and those who hadn't said they had, rather than have it supposed that no one had an inclination for them. One or two showed signs of being willing to start a flirtation with Philip, and he watched their manoeuvres with great amusement. He had had enough of love-making for some time, and he was nearly always tired and often hungry. Chapter 105. Chapter 106. Philip avoided the places he had known in happier times. The little gatherings at the tavern in Beak Street were broken up. Macalister, having let down his friends, no longer went there, and Hayward was at the Cape. Only Lawson remained, and Philip, feeling that now the painter and he had nothing in common, did not wish to see him. But one Saturday afternoon, after dinner, having changed his clothes, he walked down Regent Street to go to the Free Library in St. Martin's Lane, meaning to spend the afternoon there, and suddenly found himself face to face with him. His first instinct was to pass on without a word, but Lawson did not give him the opportunity. "Where on earth have you been all this time?" he cried. "I?" said Philip. "I wrote you and asked you to come to the studio for a Beano, and you never even answered. I didn't get your letter." "No, I know. I went to the hospital to ask for you, and I saw my letter in the rack. Have you chucked the medical?" Philip hesitated for a moment. He was ashamed to tell the truth, but the shame he felt angered him, and he forced himself to speak. He could not help reddening. "Yes, I lost the little money I had. I couldn't afford to go on with it." "I say, I'm awfully sorry. What are you doing?" "I'm a shop walker." The words choked Philip, but he was determined not to shirk the truth. He kept his eyes on Lawson and saw his embarrassment. Philip smiled savagely. "If you went into Lynn and Sedley and made your way into the made robes department, you would see me in a frock coat, walking about with a degage air and directing ladies who want to buy petticoats or stockings. 'First to the right, madam, and second on the left.'" Lawson, seeing that Philip was making a jest of it, laughed awkwardly. He did not know what to say. The picture that Philip called up horrified him, but he was afraid to show his sympathy. "That's a bit of a change for you," he said. His words seemed absurd to him, and immediately he wished he had not said them. Philip flushed darkly. "A bit," he said. "By the way, I owe you 5 bob." He put his hand in his pocket and pulled out some silver. "Oh, it doesn't matter. I'd forgotten all about it." "Go on, take it." Lawson received the money silently. They stood in the middle of the pavement, and people jostled them as they passed. There was a sardonic twinkle in Philip's eyes which made the painter intensely uncomfortable, and he could not tell that Philip's heart was heavy with despair. Lawson wanted dreadfully to do something, but he did not know what to do. "I say, won't you come to the studio and have a talk?" "No," said Philip. "Why not?" "There's nothing to talk about." He saw the pain come into Lawson's eyes. He could not help it. He was sorry, but he had to think of himself. He could not bear the thought of discussing his situation. He could endure it only by determining resolutely not to think about it. He was afraid of his weakness if once he began to open his heart. Moreover, he took irresistible dislikes to the places where he had been miserable. He remembered the humiliation he had endured when he had waited in that studio, ravenous for hunger, for Lawson to offer him a meal, and the last occasion when he had taken the 5 shillings off him. He hated the sight of Lawson because he recalled those days of utter abasement. "Then look here, come and dine with me one night. Choose your own evening." Philip was touched with the painter's kindness. All sorts of people were strangely kind to him, he thought. "It's awfully good of you, old man, but I'd rather not." He held out his hand. "Good bye." Lawson, troubled by a behaviour which seemed inexplicable, took his hand, and Philip quickly limped away. His heart was heavy, and, as was usual with him, he began to reproach himself for what he had done. He did not know what madness of pride had made him refuse the offered friendship. But he heard someone running behind him and presently Lawson's voice calling him. He stopped, and suddenly the feeling of hostility got the better of him. He presented to Lawson a cold, set face. "What is it?" "I suppose you heard about Hayward, didn't you?" "I know he went to the Cape. He died, you know, soon after landing." For a moment Philip did not answer. He could hardly believe his ears. "How?" he asked. "Oh, enteric. Hard luck, wasn't it? I thought you mightn't know. Gave me a bit of a turn when I heard it." Lawson nodded quickly and walked away. Philip felt a shiver pass through his heart. He had never before lost a friend of his own age, for the death of Cronshaw, a man so much older than himself, had seemed to come in the normal course of things. The news gave him a peculiar shock. It reminded him of his own mortality, for like everyone else, Philip, knowing perfectly that all men must die, had no intimate feeling that the same must apply to himself. And Hayward's death, though he had long ceased to have any warm feeling for him, affected him deeply. He remembered on a sudden all the good talks they had had, and it pained him to think that they would never talk with one another again. He remembered their first meeting and the pleasant months they had spent together in Heidelberg. Philip's heart sank as he thought of the lost years. He walked on mechanically, not noticing where he went, and realised suddenly with a movement of irritation that instead of turning down the Haymarket he had sauntered along Shaftesbury Avenue. It bored him to retrace his steps, and besides, with that news, he did not want to read. He wanted to sit alone and think. He made up his mind to go to the British Museum. Solitude was now his only luxury. Since he had been at Linz he had often gone there and sat in front of the groups from the Parthenon, and, not deliberately thinking, had allowed their divine masses to rest his troubled soul. But this afternoon they had nothing to say to him, and after a few minutes, impatiently, he wandered out of the room. There were too many people, provincials with foolish faces, foreigners poring over their guide books. Their hideousness besmirched the everlasting masterpieces, their restlessness troubled the gods' immortal repose. He went into another room, and here there was hardly anyone. Philip sat down wearily. His nerves were on edge. He could not get the people out of his mind. Sometimes at Linz they affected him in the same way, and he looked at them file past him with horror. They were so ugly, and there was such meanness in their faces, it was terrifying. Their features were distorted with paltry desires, and you felt they were strange to any ideas of beauty. They had furtive eyes and weak chins. There was no wickedness in them, but only pettiness and vulgarity. Their humour was a low fastidiousness. Sometimes he found himself looking at them to see what animal they resembled. He tried not to, for it quickly became an obsession, and he saw in them all the sheep, or the horse, or the fox, or the goat. Human beings filled him with disgust. But presently the influence of the place descended upon him. He felt quieter. He began to look absently at the tombstones with which the room was lined. They were the work of Athenian stonemasons of the 4th and 5th centuries before Christ, and they were very simple, work of no great talent, but with the exquisite spirit of Athens upon them. Time had mellowed the marble to the colour of honey, so that unconsciously one thought of the bees of Hymettus and softened their outlines. Some represented a nude figure sitting on a bench, some the departure of the dead from those who loved him, and some the dead clasping their hands with one who remained behind. Of all was the tragic word farewell. That and nothing more. Their simplicity was infinitely touching. Friend parted from friend, the son from his mother, and the restraint made the survivor's grief more poignant. It was so long, long ago, and century upon century had passed over that unhappiness. For 2,000 years those who had wept had been dust as those they wept for. But the woe was alive still, and it filled Philip's heart so that he felt compassion spring up in it, and he said, "Poor things, poor things." And it came to him that the gaping sightseers and the fat strangers with their guide books, and all those mean common people who thronged the shop with their trivial desires and vulgar cares, were mortal and must die. They too loved, and must part from those they loved, the son from his mother, the wife from her husband. And perhaps it was more tragic because their lives were ugly and sordid, and they knew nothing that gave beauty to the world. There was one stone which was very beautiful, a bas relief of two young men holding each other's hand, and the reticence of line, the simplicity, made one like to think that the sculptor here had been touched with a genuine emotion. It was an exquisite memorial to that than which the world offers but one thing more precious, to a friendship, and as Philip looked at it he felt the tears come to his eyes. He thought of Hayward and his eager admiration for him when first they met, and how disillusion had come and then indifference, till nothing held them together but habit and old memories. It was one of the queer things of life that you saw a person every day for months, and were so intimate with him that you could not imagine existence without him. Then separation came, and everything went on in the same way, and the companion who had seemed essential proved unnecessary. Your life proceeded, and you did not even miss him. Philip thought of those early days in Heidelberg when Hayward, capable of great things, had been full of enthusiasm for the future, and how, little by little, achieving nothing, he had resigned himself to failure. Now he was dead. His death had been as futile as his life. He died ingloriously, of a stupid disease, failing once more, even at the end, to accomplish anything. It was just the same now as if he had never lived. Philip asked himself desperately, what was the use of living at all? It all seemed inane. It was the same with Cronshaw. It was quite unimportant that he had lived. He was dead and forgotten, his book of poems sold in remainder by second-hand booksellers. His life seemed to have served nothing except to give a pushing journalist occasion to write an article in a review. And Philip cried out in his soul, "What is the use of it?" This effort was so incommensurate with the result. The bright hopes of youth had to be paid for at such a bitter price of disillusionment. Pain and disease and unhappiness weighed down the scale so heavily. What did it all mean? He thought of his own life, the high hopes with which he had entered upon it, the limitations which his body forced upon him, his friendlessness, and the lack of affection which had surrounded his youth. He did not know that he had never done anything but what seemed best to do, and what a cropper he had come. Other men with no more advantages than he succeeded, and others again with many more failed. It seemed pure chance. The rain fell alike upon the just and upon the unjust, and for nothing was there a why and a wherefore. Thinking of Cronshaw, Philip remembered the Persian rug which he had given him, telling him that it offered an answer to his question upon the meaning of life. And suddenly the answer occurred to him. He chuckled. Now that he had it, it was like one of the puzzles which you worry over till you are shown the solution, and then cannot imagine how it could ever have escaped you. The answer was obvious. Life had no meaning. On the earth, satellite of a star speeding through space, living things had arisen under the influence of conditions which were part of the planet's history, and as there had been a beginning of life upon it, so, under the influence of other conditions, there would be an end. Man, no more significant than other forms of life, had come not as the climax of creation, but as a physical reaction to the environment. Philip remembered the story of the Eastern king who, desiring to know the history of man, was brought by a sage 500 volumes. Busy with affairs of state, he bade him go and condense it. In 20 years the sage returned, and his history now was in no more than 50 volumes. But the king, too old then to read so many ponderous tomes, bade him go and shorten it once more. 20 years passed again, and the sage, old and gray, brought a single book in which was the knowledge the king had sought. But the king lay on his deathbed, and he had no time to read even that. And then the sage gave him the history of man in a single line. It was this: he was born, he suffered, and he died. There was no meaning in life, and man, by living, served no end. It was immaterial whether he was born or not born, whether he lived or ceased to live. Life was insignificant, and death without consequence. Philip exulted as he had exulted in his boyhood when the weight of a belief in God was lifted from his shoulders. It seemed to him that the last burden of responsibility was taken from him, and for the first time he was utterly free. His insignificance was turned to power, and he felt himself suddenly equal with the cruel fate which had seemed to persecute him. For if life was meaningless, the world was robbed of its cruelty. What he did or left undone did not matter. Failure was unimportant, and success amounted to nothing. He was the most inconsiderate creature in that swarming mass of mankind which for a brief space occupied the surface of the earth, and he was almighty because he had wrenched from chaos the secret of its nothingness. Thoughts came tumbling over one another in Philip's eager fancy, and he took long breaths of joyous satisfaction. He felt inclined to leap and sing. He had not been so happy for months. "O life," he cried in his heart, "O life, where is thy sting?" For the same uprush of fancy which had shown him with all the force of mathematical demonstration that life had no meaning, brought with it another idea. And that was why Cronshaw, he imagined, had given him the Persian rug. As the weaver elaborated his pattern for no end but the pleasure of his aesthetic sense, so might a man live his life or if one was forced to believe that his actions were outside his choosing, so might a man look at his life that it made a pattern. There was as little need to do this as there was use. It was merely something he did for his own pleasure. Out of the manifold events of his life, his deeds, his feelings, his thoughts, he might make a design, regular, elaborate, complicated, or beautiful. And though it might be no more than an illusion that he had the power of selection, though it might be no more than a fantastic legerdemain in which appearances were interwoven with moonbeams, that did not matter. It seemed, and so to him it was. In the vast warp of life, a river arising from no spring and flowing endlessly to no sea, with the background to his fancies that there was no meaning and that nothing was important, a man might get a personal satisfaction in selecting the various strands that worked out the pattern. There was one pattern, the most obvious, perfect and beautiful, in which a man was born, grew to manhood, married, produced children, toiled for his bread, and died. But there were others, intricate and wonderful, in which happiness did not enter and in which success was not attempted, and in them might be discovered a more troubling grace. Some lives, and Hayward's was among them, the blind indifference of chance cut off while the design was still imperfect, and then the solace was comfortable that it did not matter. Other lives, such as Cronshaw's, offered a pattern which was difficult to follow. The point of view had to be shifted, and old standards had to be altered, before one could understand that such a life was its own justification. Philip thought that in throwing over the desire for happiness he was casting aside the last of his illusions. His life had seemed horrible when it was measured by its happiness, but now he seemed to gather strength as he realized that it might be measured by something else. Happiness mattered as little as pain. They came in, both of them, as all the other details of his life came in, to the elaboration of the design. He seemed, for an instant, to stand above the accidents of his existence, and he felt that they could not affect him again as they had done before. Whatever happened to him now would be one more motive to add to the complexity of the pattern, and when the end approached he would rejoice in its completion. It would be a work of art, and it would be none the less beautiful because he alone knew of its existence, and with his death it would at once cease to be. Philip was happy. Chapter 106. Chapter 107. Mr. Sampson, the buyer, took a fancy to Philip. Mr. Sampson was very dashing, and the girls in his department said they would not be surprised if he married one of the rich customers. He lived out of town and often impressed the assistants by putting on his evening clothes in the office. Sometimes he would be seen by those on sweeping duty coming in next morning still dressed, and they would wink gravely to one another while he went into his office and changed into a frock coat. On these occasions, having slipped out for a hurried breakfast, he would also wink at Philip as he walked up the stairs on his way back and rub his hands. "What a night! What a night!" he said. "My word!" He told Philip that he was the only gentleman there, and he and Philip were the only fellows who knew what life was. Having said this, he changed his manner suddenly, called Philip Mr. Carey instead of old boy, assumed the importance due to his position as buyer, and put Philip back into his place of shop walker. Len and Sedley received fashion papers from Paris once a week, and adapted the costumes illustrated in them to the needs of their customers. Their clientele was peculiar. The most substantial part consisted of women from the smaller manufacturing towns, who were too elegant to have their frocks made locally, and not sufficiently acquainted with London to discover good dressmakers within their means. Beside these, incongruously, was a large number of music hall artistes. This was a connection that Mr. Sampson had worked up for himself and took great pride in. They had begun by getting their stage costumes at Lynn's, and he had induced many of them to get their other clothes there as well. "As good as Paquin and half the price," he said. He had a persuasive, hail fellow well met air with him which appealed to customers of this sort, and they said to one another, "What's the good of throwing money away when you can get a coat and skirt at Lynn's that nobody knows didn't come from Paris?" Mr. Sampson was very proud of his friendship with the popular favorites whose frocks he made, and when he went out to dinner at 2 o'clock on Sunday with Miss Victorien Virgo, quote, "She was wearing that powder blue we made her, and I lay she didn't let on it come from us. I 'ad to tell her meself that if I 'adn't designed it with my own 'ands, I'd have said it must have come from Paquin." End quote. At her beautiful house in Tulse Hill he regaled the department next day with abundant details. Philip had never paid much attention to women's clothes, but in the course of time he began, a little amused at himself, to take a technical interest in them. He had an eye for colour which was more highly trained than that of anyone in the department, and he had kept from his student days in Paris some knowledge of line. Mr. Sampson, an ignorant man conscious of his own incompetence, but with a shrewdness that enabled him to combine with other people's suggestions, constantly asked the opinion of the assistants in his department in making up new designs. And he had the quickness to see that Philip's criticisms were valuable. But he was very jealous, and would never allow that he took anyone's advice. When he had altered some drawing in accordance with Philip's suggestion, he always finished up by saying, "Well, it comes round to my own idea in the end." One day, when Philip had been at the shop for 5 months, Miss Alice Antonio, the well-known serio comic, came in and asked to see Mr. Sampson. She was a large woman with flaxen hair and a boldly painted face, a metallic voice, and the breezy manner of a comedienne accustomed to be on friendly terms with the gallery boys of provincial music halls. She had a new song and wished Mr. Sampson to design a costume for her. "I want something striking," she said. "I don't want any old thing you know. I want something different from what anybody else has." Mr. Sampson, bland and familiar, said he was quite certain they could get her the very thing she required. He showed her sketches. "I know there's nothing here that would do, but I just want to show you the kind of thing I would suggest." "Oh, no, that's not the sort of thing at all," she said, as she glanced at them impatiently. "What I want is something that'll just hit 'em in the jaw and make their front teeth rattle." "Yes, I quite understand, Miss Antonia," said the buyer, with a bland smile, but his eyes grew blank and stupid. "I expect I shall 'ave to pop over to Paris for it in the end." "Oh, I think we can give you satisfaction, Miss Antonio. What you can get in Paris you can get here." When she had swept out of the department, Mr. Sampson, a little worried, discussed the matter with Mrs. Hodges. "She's a caution and no mistake," said Mrs. Hodges. "Alice, where art thou?" remarked the buyer irritably, and thought he had scored a point against her. His ideas of music hall costumes had never gone beyond short skirts, a swirl of lace, and glittering sequins, but Miss Antonia had expressed herself on that subject in no uncertain terms. "Oh, my aunt," she said. And the invocation was uttered in such a tone as to indicate a rooted antipathy to anything so commonplace, even if she had not added that sequins gave her the sick. Mr. Sampson got out 1 or 2 ideas, but Mrs. Hodges told him frankly she did not think they would do. It was she who gave Philip the suggestion. "Can you draw, Phil? Why don't you try your 'and and see what you can do?" Philip bought a cheap box of water colours, and in the evening, while Bell, the noisy lad of 16, whistling 3 notes, busied himself with his stamps, he made 1 or 2 sketches. He remembered some of the costumes he had seen in Paris, and he adapted one of them, getting his effect from a combination of violent, unusual colours. The result amused him, and next morning he showed it to Mrs. Hodges. She was somewhat astonished, but took it at once to the buyer. "It's unusual," he said. "There's no denying that." It puzzled him, and at the same time his trained eye saw that it would make up admirably. To save his face he began making suggestions for altering it, but Mrs. Hodges, with more sense, advised him to show it to Miss Antonia as it was. "It's neck or nothing with her, and she may take a fancy to it." "It's a good deal more nothing than neck," said Mr. Sampson, looking at the décolletage. "He can draw, can't he? Fancy him keeping it dark all this time." When Miss Antonia was announced, the buyer placed the design on the table in such a position that it must catch her eye the moment she was shown into his office. She pounced on it at once. "What's that?" she said. "Why can't I have that?" "It's just an idea we got out for you," said Mr. Sampson casually. "Do you like it?" "Do I like it?" she said. "Give me 'alf a pint with a little drop of gin in it." "Ah, you see, you don't have to go to Paris. You've only got to say what you want, and there you are." The work was put in hand at once, and Philip felt quite a thrill of satisfaction when he saw the costume completed. The buyer and Mrs. Hodges took all the credit of it, but he did not care, and when he went with them to the Tivoli to see Miss Antonia wear it for the first time, he was filled with elation. In answer to her questions he at last told Mrs. Hodges how he had learnt to draw, fearing that the people he lived with would think he wanted to put on airs. He had always taken the greatest care to say nothing about his past occupations, and she repeated the information to Mr. Sampson. The buyer said nothing to him on the subject, but began to treat him a little more deferentially, and presently gave him designs to do for two of the country customers. They met with satisfaction. Then he began to speak to his clients of a clever young feller, Paris art student, you know, who worked for him, and soon Philip, ensconced behind a screen in his shirt sleeves, was drawing from morning till night. Sometimes he was so busy that he had to dine at 3 with the stragglers. He liked it, because there were few of them, and they were all too tired to talk. The food also was better, for it consisted of what was left over from the buyer's table. Philip's rise from shop walker to designer of costumes had a great effect on the department. He realized that he was an object of envy. Harris, the assistant with the queer-shaped head, who was the first person he had known at the shop and had attached himself to Philip, could not conceal his bitterness. "Some people 'ave all the luck," he said. "You'll be a buyer yourself one of these days, and we shall all be calling you sir." He told Philip that he should demand higher wages, for, notwithstanding the difficult work he was now engaged in, he received no more than the 6 shillings a week with which he started. But it was a ticklish matter to ask for a rise. The manager had a sardonic way of dealing with such applicants. "Think you're worth more, do you? How much do you think you're worth, eh?" The assistant, with his heart in his mouth, would suggest that he thought he ought to have another 2 shillings a week. "Oh, very well, if you think you're worth it, you can 'ave it." Then he paused, and sometimes with a steely eye added, "And you can 'ave your notice too." It was no use then to withdraw your request. You had to go. The manager's idea was that assistants who were dissatisfied did not work properly, and if they were not worth a rise it was better to sack them at once. The result was that they never asked for one unless they were prepared to leave. Philip hesitated. He was a little suspicious of the men in his room who told him that the buyer could not do without him. They were decent fellows, but their sense of humour was primitive, and it would have seemed funny to them if they had persuaded Philip to ask for more wages and he were sacked. He could not forget the mortification he had suffered in looking for work. He did not wish to expose himself to that again, and he knew there was small chance of his getting elsewhere a post as designer. There were hundreds of people about who could draw as well as he. But he wanted money very badly. His clothes were worn out, and the heavy carpets rotted his socks and boots. He had almost persuaded himself to take the venturesome step when, one morning, passing up from breakfast in the basement through the passage that led to the manager's office, he saw a queue of men waiting in answer to an advertisement. There were about 100 of them, and whichever was engaged would be offered his keep and the same 6 shillings a week that Philip had. He saw some of them cast envious glances at him because he had employment. It made him shudder. He dared not risk it. End of chapter 107. Recording by Of Human Bondage by W. Somerset Maugham. Chapter 108. The winter passed. Now and then Philip went to the hospital, slinking in when it was late and there was little chance of meeting anyone he knew, to see whether there were letters for him. At Easter he received one from his uncle. He was surprised to hear from him, for the vicar of Blackstable had never written him more than half a dozen letters in his whole life, and they were on business matters. Dear Philip, if you are thinking of taking a holiday soon, and care to come down here, I shall be pleased to see you. I was very ill with my bronchitis in the winter, and Dr. Wigram never expected me to pull through. I have a wonderful constitution, and I made, thank God, a marvellous recovery. Yours affectionately, William Carey. The letter made Philip angry. How did his uncle think he was living? He did not even trouble to inquire. He might have starved for all the old man cared. But as he walked home something struck him. He stopped under a lamp-post and read the letter again. The handwriting had no longer the business-like firmness which had characterized it. It was larger and wavering. Perhaps the illness had shaken him more than he was willing to confess, and he sought in that formal note to express a yearning to see the only relation he had in the world. Philip wrote back that he could come down to Blackstable for a fortnight in July. The invitation was convenient, for he had not known what to do with his brief holiday. The Athelnys went hopping in September, but he could not then be spared, since during that month the autumn models were prepared. The rule of Lynn's was that everyone must take a fortnight whether he wanted it or not, and during that time, if he had nowhere to go, an assistant might sleep in his room, but he was not allowed food. A number had no friends within reasonable distance of London, and to these the holiday was an awkward interval when they had to provide food out of their small wages, and, with the whole day on their hands, had nothing to spend. Philip had not been out of London since his visit to Brighton with Mildred, now 2 years before, and he longed for fresh air and the silence of the sea. He thought of it with such a passionate desire all through May and June that, when at length the time came for him to go, he was listless. On his last evening, when he talked with the buyer of 1 or 2 jobs he had to leave over, Mr. Sampson suddenly said to him, "What wages have you been getting?" 6 shillings. "I don't think it's enough. I'll see that you're put up to 12 when you come back." "Thank you very much," smiled Philip. "I'm beginning to want some new clothes badly." "If you stick to your work and don't go larking about with the girls like what some of them do, I'll look after you, Carey. Mind you, you've got a lot to learn, but you're promising, I'll say that for you, you're promising, and I'll see that you get £1 a week as soon as you deserve it." Philip wondered how long he would have to wait for that. 2 years? He was startled at the change in his uncle. When last he had seen him he was a stout man who held himself upright, clean-shaven, with a round, sensual face. But he had fallen in strangely. His skin was yellow. There were great bags under the eyes, and he was bent and old. He had grown a beard during his last illness, and he walked very slowly. "I'm not at my best to-day," he said when Philip, having just arrived, was sitting with him in the dining-room. "The heat upsets me." Philip, asking after the affairs of the parish, looked at him and wondered how much longer he could last. A hot summer would finish him. Philip noticed how thin his hands were. They trembled. It meant so much to Philip. If he died that summer he could go back to the hospital at the beginning of the winter session. His heart leaped at the thought of returning no more to Lynn's. At dinner the vicar sat humped up on his chair, and the housekeeper, who had been with him since his wife's death, said, "Shall Mr. Philip carve, sir?" The old man, who had been about to do so from disinclination to confess his weakness, seemed glad at the first suggestion to relinquish the attempt. "You've got a very good appetite," said Philip. "Oh yes, I always eat well, but I'm thinner than when you were here last. I'm glad to be thinner. I didn't like being so fat. Dr. Wigram thinks I'm all the better for being thinner than I was." When dinner was over the housekeeper brought him some medicine. "Show the prescription to Master Philip," he said. "He's a doctor too. I'd like him to see that he thinks it's all right. I told Dr. Wigram that now you're studying to be a doctor he ought to make a reduction in his charges. It's dreadful the bills I've had to pay. He came every day for 2 months, and he charges 5 shillings a visit. It's a lot of money, isn't it? He comes twice a week still. I'm going to tell him he needn't come any more. I'll send for him if I want him." He looked at Philip eagerly while he read the prescriptions. They were narcotics. There were 2 of them, and one was a medicine which the Vicar explained he was to use only if his neuritis grew unendurable. "I'm very careful," he said. "I don't want to get into the opium habit." He did not mention his nephew's affairs. Philip fancied that it was by way of precaution, in case he asked for money, that his uncle kept dwelling on the financial calls upon him. He had spent so much on the doctor and so much more on the chemist. While he was ill they had had to have a fire every day in his bedroom, and now on Sunday he needed a carriage to go to church in the evening as well as in the morning. Philip felt angrily inclined to say he need not be afraid, he was not going to borrow from him, but he held his tongue. It seemed to him that everything had left the old man now but 2 things: pleasure in his food and a grasping desire for money. It was a hideous old age. In the afternoon Dr. Wigram came, and after the visit Philip walked with him to the garden gate. "How do you think he is?" said Philip. Dr. Wigram was more anxious not to do wrong than to do right, and he never hazarded a definite opinion if he could help it. He had practised at Blackstable for 35 years. He had the reputation of being very safe, and many of his patients thought it much better that a doctor should be safe than clever. There was a new man at Blackstable. He had been settled there for 10 years, but they still looked upon him as an interloper, and he was said to be very clever, but he had not much practice among the better people because no one really knew anything about him. "Oh, he's as well as can be expected," said Dr. Wigram in answer to Philip's inquiry. "Has he got anything seriously the matter with him?" "Well, Philip, your uncle is no longer a young man," said the doctor with a cautious little smile, which suggested that after all the Vicar of Blackstable was not an old man either. "He seems to think his heart's in a bad way." "I'm not satisfied with his heart," hazarded the doctor. "I think he should be careful, very careful." On the tip of Philip's tongue was the question: how much longer can he live? He was afraid it would shock. In these matters a paraphrase was demanded by the decorum of life, but, as he asked another question instead, it flashed through him that the doctor must be accustomed to the impatience of a sick man's relatives. He must see through their sympathetic expressions. Philip, with a faint smile at his own hypocrisy, cast down his eyes. "I suppose he's in no immediate danger?" This was the kind of question the doctor hated. If you said a patient couldn't live another month, the family prepared itself for a bereavement, and if then the patient lived on, they visited the medical attendant with the resentment they felt at having tormented themselves before it was necessary. On the other hand, if you said the patient might live a year, and he died in a week, the family said you did not know your business. They thought of all the affection they would have lavished on the defunct if they had known the end was so near. Dr. Wigram made the gesture of washing his hands. "I don't think there's any grave risk so long as he remains as he is," he ventured at last. "But on the other hand, we mustn't forget that he's no longer a young man, and, well, the machine is wearing out. If he gets over the hot weather, I don't see why he shouldn't get on very comfortably till the winter, and then if the winter does not bother him too much, well, I don't see why anything should happen." Philip went back to the dining room where his uncle was sitting. With his skull cap and a crochet shawl over his shoulders, he looked grotesque. His eyes had been fixed on the door, and they rested on Philip's face as he entered. Philip saw that his uncle had been waiting anxiously for his return. "Well, what did he say about me?" Philip understood suddenly that the old man was frightened of dying. It made Philip a little ashamed, so that he looked away involuntarily. He was always embarrassed by the weakness of human nature. "He says he thinks you're much better," said Philip. A gleam of delight came into his uncle's eyes. "I've got a wonderful constitution," he said. "What else did he say?" he added suspiciously. Philip smiled. "He said that if you take care of yourself there's no reason why you shouldn't live to be 100. I don't know that I can expect to do that, but I don't see why I shouldn't see 80. My mother lived till she was 84. There was a little table by the side of Mr. Carey's chair, and on it were a Bible and a large volume of the Common Prayer from which for so many years he had been accustomed to read to his household. He stretched out now his shaking hand and took his Bible. "Those old patriarchs lived to a jolly good old age, didn't they?" he said, with a queer little laugh in which Philip read a sort of timid appeal. The old man clung to life, yet he believed implicitly all that his religion taught him. He had no doubt in the immortality of the soul, and he felt that he had conducted himself well enough, according to his capacities, to make it very likely that he would go to heaven. In his long career to how many dying persons must he have administered the consolations of religion? Perhaps he was like the doctor who could get no benefit from his own prescriptions. Philip was puzzled and shocked by that eager cleaving to the earth. He wondered what nameless horror was at the back of the old man's mind. He would have liked to probe into his soul so that he might see in its nakedness the dreadful dismay of the unknown which he suspected. The fortnight passed quickly, and Philip returned to London. He passed the sweltering August behind his screen in the costumes department, drawing in his shirt sleeves. The assistants in relays went for their holidays. In the evening Philip generally went into Hyde Park and listened to the band. Growing more accustomed to his work, it tired him less, and his mind, recovering from its long stagnation, sought for fresh activity. His whole desire now was set on his uncle's death. He kept on dreaming the same dream. A telegram was handed to him one morning early which announced the vicar's sudden demise, and freedom was in his grasp. When he awoke and found it was nothing but a dream, he was filled with sombre rage. He occupied himself, now that the event seemed likely to happen at any time, with elaborate plans for the future. In these he passed rapidly over the year which he must spend before it was possible for him to be qualified, and dwelt on the journey to Spain on which his heart was set. He read books about that country which he borrowed from the Free Library, and already he knew from photographs exactly what each city looked like. He saw himself lingering in Cordova on the bridge that spanned the Guadalquivir. He wandered through tortuous streets in Toledo and sat in churches where he wrung from El Greco the secret which he felt the mysterious painter held for him. Athelny entered into his humour, and on Sunday afternoons they made out elaborate itineraries, so that Philip should miss nothing that was noteworthy. To cheat his impatience, Philip began to teach himself Spanish, and in the deserted sitting-room in Harrington Street he spent an hour every evening doing Spanish exercises and puzzling out with an English translation by his side the magnificent phrases of Don Quixote. Athelny gave him a lesson once a week, and Philip learnt a few sentences to help him on his journey. Mrs. Athelny laughed at them. "You two and your Spanish," she said. "Why don't you do something useful?" But Sally, who was growing up and was to put up her hair at Christmas, stood by sometimes and listened in her grave way while her father and Philip exchanged remarks in a language she did not understand. She thought her father the most wonderful man who had ever existed, and she expressed her opinion of Philip only through her father's commendations. "Father thinks a rare lot of your Uncle Philip," she remarked to her brothers and sisters. Thorpe, the eldest boy, was old enough to go on the Arethusa, and Athelny regaled his family with magnificent descriptions of the appearance the lad would make when he came back in uniform for his holidays. As soon as Sally was 17, she was to be apprenticed to a dressmaker. Athelny, in his rhetorical way, talked of the birds, strong enough to fly now, who were leaving the parental nest, and with tears in his eyes told them that the nest would be there still if ever they wished to return to it. A shakedown and a dinner would always be theirs, and the heart of a father would never be closed to the troubles of his children. "You do talk, Athelny," said his wife. "I don't know what trouble they're likely to get into so long as they're steady. So long as you're honest and not afraid of work, you'll never be out of a job, that's what I think, and I can tell you I shan't be sorry when I see the last of them earning their own living." Childbearing, hard work, and constant anxiety were beginning to tell on Mrs. Athelny, and sometimes her back ached in the evening so that she had to sit down and rest herself. Her ideal of happiness was to have a girl to do the rough work so that she need not herself get up before 7. Athelny waved his beautiful white hand. "Ah, my Betty, we've deserved well of the state, you and I. We've reared 9 healthy children, and the boys shall serve their king. The girls shall cook and sew, and in their turn breed healthy children." He turned to Sally, and to comfort her for the anticlimax of the contrast, added grandiloquently, "They also serve who only stand and wait." Athelny had lately added socialism to the other contradictory theories he vehemently believed in, and he stated now: "In a socialist state we should be richly pensioned, you and I, Betty." "Oh, don't talk to me about your socialists. I've got no patience with them," she cried. "It only means that another lot of lazy loafers will make a good thing out of the working classes. My motto is, leave me alone. I don't want anyone interfering with me. I'll make the best of a bad job, and the devil take the hindmost." "Do you call life a bad job?" said Athelny. "Never. We've had our ups and downs, we've had our struggles, we've always been poor, but it's been worth it, aye, worth it 100 times, I say, when I look round at my children." "You do talk, Athelny," she said, looking at him, not with anger, but with scornful calm. "You've had the pleasant part of the children. I've had the bearing of them and the bearing with them. I don't say that I'm not fond of them now they're there, but if I had my time over again I'd remain single. Why, if I'd remained single I might have a little shop by now, and 400 or 500 pounds in the bank, and a girl to do the rough work. Oh, I wouldn't go over my life again, not for something." Philip thought of the countless millions to whom life is no more than unending labor, neither beautiful nor ugly, but just to be accepted in the same spirit as one accepts the changes of the seasons. Fury seized him because it all seemed useless. He could not reconcile himself to the belief that life had no meaning, and yet everything he saw, all his thoughts, added to the force of his conviction. But though fury seized him, it was a joyful fury. Life was not so horrible if it was meaningless, and he faced it with a strange sense of power. Chapter 108. Chapter 109. The autumn passed into winter. Philip had left his address with Mrs. Foster, his uncle's housekeeper, so that she might communicate with him, but still went once a week to the hospital on the chance of there being a letter. One evening he saw his name on an envelope in a handwriting he had hoped never to see again. It gave him a queer feeling. For a little while he could not bring himself to take it. It brought back a host of hateful memories. But at length, impatient with himself, he ripped open the envelope. 7 William Street, Fitzroy Square. Dear Phil, can I see you for a minute or two as soon as possible? I am in awful trouble and don't know what to do. It's not money. Yours truly, Mildred. He tore the letter into little bits and going out into the street scattered them in the darkness. "I'll see her damned," he muttered. A feeling of disgust surged up in him at the thought of seeing her again. He did not care if she was in distress. It served her right, whatever it was. He thought of her with hatred, and the love he had had for her aroused his loathing. His recollections filled him with nausea, and as he walked across the Thames he drew himself aside in an instinctive withdrawal from his thought of her. He went to bed, but he could not sleep. He wondered what was the matter with her, and he could not get out of his head the fear that she was ill and hungry. She would not have written to him unless she were desperate. He was angry with himself for his weakness, but he knew that he would have no peace unless he saw her. Next morning he wrote a letter card and posted it on his way to the shop. He made it as stiff as he could and said merely that he was sorry she was in difficulties and would come to the address she had given him at 7 o'clock that evening. It was that of a shabby lodging-house in a sordid street, and when, sick at the thought of seeing her, he asked whether she was in, a wild hope seized him that she had left. It looked the sort of place people moved in and out of frequently. He had not thought of looking at the postmark on her letter and did not know how many days it had lain in the rack. The woman who answered the bell did not reply to his inquiry, but silently preceded him along the passage and knocked on a door at the back. "Mrs. Miller, a gentleman to see you," she called. The door was slightly opened, and Mildred looked out suspiciously. "Oh, it's you," she said. "Come in." He walked in and she closed the door. It was a very small bedroom, untidy as was every place she lived in. There was a pair of shoes on the floor, lying apart from one another and uncleaned. A hat was on the chest of drawers, with false curls beside it, and there was a blouse on the table. Philip looked for somewhere to put his hat. The hooks behind the door were laden with skirts, and he noticed that they were muddy at the hem. "Sit down, won't you?" she said. Then she gave a little awkward laugh. "I suppose you were surprised to hear from me again." "You're awfully hoarse," he answered. "Have you got a sore throat?" "Yes, I have had for some time." He did not say anything. He waited for her to explain why she wanted to see him. The look of the room told him clearly enough that she had gone back to the life from which he had taken her. He wondered what had happened to the baby. There was a photograph of it on the chimney-piece, but no sign in the room that a child was ever there. Mildred was holding her handkerchief. She made it into a little ball and passed it from hand to hand. He saw that she was very nervous. She was staring at the fire, and he could look at her without meeting her eyes. She was much thinner than when she had left him, and the skin, yellow and dryish, was drawn more tightly over her cheekbones. She had dyed her hair, and it was now flaxen. It altered her a good deal and made her look more vulgar. "I was relieved to get your letter, I can tell you," she said at last. "I thought p'raps you weren't at the 'ospital any more." Philip did not speak. "I suppose you're qualified by now, aren't you?" "No." "How's that?" "I'm no longer at the hospital. I had to give it up 18 months ago." "You are changeable. You don't seem as if you could stick to anything." Philip was silent for another moment, and when he went on it was with coldness. "I lost the little money I had in an unlucky speculation, and I couldn't afford to go on with the medical. I had to earn my living as best I could." "What are you doing then?" "I'm in a shop." "Oh." She gave him a quick glance and turned her eyes away at once. He thought that she reddened. She dabbed her palms nervously with the handkerchief. "You've not forgotten all your doctoring, have you?" She jerked the words out quite oddly. "Not entirely." "Because that's why I wanted to see you." Her voice sank to a hoarse whisper. "I don't know what's the matter with me." "Why don't you go to a hospital?" "I don't like to do that and have all the students staring at me, and I'm afraid they'd want to keep me." "What are you complaining of?" asked Philip coldly, with the stereotyped phrase used in the out patients' room. "Well, I've come out in a rash, and I can't get rid of it." Philip felt a twinge of horror in his heart. Sweat broke out on his forehead. "Let me look at your throat?" He took her over to the window and made such examination as he could. Suddenly he caught sight of her eyes. There was deadly fear in them. It was horrible to see. She was terrified. She wanted him to reassure her. She looked at him pleadingly, not daring to ask for words of comfort, but with all her nerves astrung to receive them. He had none to offer her. "I'm afraid you're very ill indeed," he said. "What do you think it is?" When he told her she grew deathly pale and her lips even turned yellow. She began to cry, hopelessly, quietly at first, and then with choking sobs. "I'm awfully sorry," he said at last, "but I had to tell you. I may just as well kill myself and have done with it." He took no notice of the threat. "Have you got any money?" he asked. £6 or £7. "You must give up this life, you know. Don't you think you could find some work to do?" "I'm afraid I can't help you much. I've only got 12 bob a week." "What is there I can do now?" she cried impatiently. "Damn it all, you must try to get something." He spoke to her very gravely, telling her of her own danger and the danger to which she exposed others, and she listened sullenly. He tried to console her. At last he brought her to a sulky acquiescence in which she promised to do all he advised. He wrote a prescription, which he said he would leave at the nearest chemist, and he impressed upon her the necessity of taking her medicine with the utmost regularity. Getting up to go, he held up his hand. "Don't be downhearted. You'll soon get over your throat." But as he went, her face became suddenly distorted, and she caught hold of his throat. "Oh, don't leave me," she cried hoarsely. "I'm so afraid. Don't leave me alone yet. Phil, please. There's no one else I can go to. You're the only friend I've ever had." He felt the terror of her soul, and it was strangely like that terror he had seen in his uncle's eyes when he feared that he might die. Philip looked down. Twice that woman had come into his life and made him wretched. She had no claim upon him, and yet, he knew not why, deep in his heart was a strange aching. It was that which, when he received her letter, had left him no peace till he obeyed her summons. "I suppose I shall never really quite get over it," he said to himself. What perplexed him was that he felt a curious physical distaste which made it uncomfortable for him to be near her. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "Let's go out and dine together. I'll pay." He hesitated. He felt that she was creeping back again into his life when he thought she was gone out of it for ever. She watched him with sickening anxiety. "Oh, I know I've treated you shocking, but don't leave me alone now. You've had your revenge. If you leave me by myself now, I don't know what I shall do." "All right, I don't mind," he said, "but we shall have to do it on the cheap. I haven't got money to throw away these days." She sat down and put her shoes on, then changed her skirt and put on a hat, and they walked out together till they found a restaurant in the Tottenham Court Road. Philip had got out of the habit of eating at those hours, and Mildred's throat was so sore that she could not swallow. They had a little cold ham, and Philip drank a glass of beer. They sat opposite one another, as they had so often sat before. He wondered if she remembered. They had nothing to say to one another, and would have sat in silence if Philip had not forced himself to talk. In the bright light of the restaurant, with its vulgar-looking glasses that reflected in an endless series, she looked old and haggard. Philip was anxious to know about the child, but he had not the courage to ask. At last she said: "You know, baby died last summer." "Oh," he said. "You might say you're sorry." "I'm not," he answered. "I'm very glad." She glanced at him and, understanding what he meant, looked away. "You were rare struck on it at one time, weren't you? I always thought it funny like how you could see so much in another man's child." When they had finished eating, they called at the chemist's for the medicine Philip had ordered, and going back to the shabby room, he made her take a dose. Then they sat together till it was time for Philip to go back to Harrington Street. He was hideously bored. Philip went to see her every day. She took the medicine he had prescribed and followed his directions, and soon the results were so apparent that she gained the greatest confidence in Philip's skill. As she grew better she grew less despondent. She talked more freely. "As soon as I can get a job I shall be all right," she said. "I've had my lesson now, and I mean to profit by it. No more racketing about for yours truly." Each time he saw her, Philip asked whether she had found work. She told him not to worry, she would find something to do as soon as she wanted it. She had several strings to her bow. It was all the better not to do anything for a week or two. He could not deny this, but at the end of that time he became more insistent. She laughed at him, she was much more cheerful now, and said he was a fussy old thing. She told him long stories of the manageresses she interviewed, for her idea was to get work at some eating house, what they said and what she answered. Nothing definite was fixed, but she was sure to settle something at the beginning of the following week. There was no use hurrying, and it would be a mistake to take something unsuitable. "It's absurd to talk like that," he said impatiently. "You must take anything you can get. I can't help you, and your money won't last forever." "Oh, well, I'm not come to the end of it yet, and chance it." He looked at her sharply. It was 3 weeks since his first visit, and she had then less than £7. Suspicion seized him. He remembered some of the things she had said. He put two and two together. He wondered whether she had made any attempt to find work. Perhaps she had been lying to him all the time. It was very strange that her money should have lasted so long. "What is your rent here?" "Oh, the landlady's very nice, different from what some of them are. She's quite willing to wait till it's convenient for me to pay." He was silent. What he suspected was so horrible that he hesitated. It was no use to ask her, she would deny everything. If he wanted to know, he must find out for himself. He was in the habit of leaving her every evening at 8, and when the clock struck he got up. But instead of going back to Harrington Street, he stationed himself at the corner of Fitzroy Square so that he could see anyone who came along William Street. It seemed to him that he waited an interminable time, and he was on the point of going away, thinking his surmise had been mistaken, when the door of number 7 opened and Mildred came out. He fell back into the darkness and watched her walk towards him. She had on the hat with a quantity of feathers on it which he had seen in her room, and she wore a dress he recognized too showy for the street and unsuitable to the time of the year. He followed her slowly till she came into the Tottenham Court Road, where she slackened her pace. At the corner of Oxford Street she stopped, looked round, and crossed over to a music hall. He went up to her and touched her on the arm. He saw that she had rouged her cheeks and painted her lips. "Where are you going, Mildred?" She started at the sound of his voice and reddened as she always did when she was caught in a lie. Then the flash of anger which he knew so well came into her eyes as she instinctively sought to defend herself by abuse. But she did not say the words which were on the tip of her tongue. "Oh, I was only going to see the show. It gives me the hump sitting every night by myself." He did not pretend to believe her. "You mustn't. Good heavens, I've told you 50 times how dangerous it is. You must stop this sort of thing at once." "Oh, hold your jaw," she cried roughly. "How do you suppose I'm going to live?" He took hold of her arm and, without thinking what he was doing, tried to drag her away. "For God's sake, come along. Let me take you home. You don't know what you're doing. It's criminal." "What do I care? Let them take their chance. Men haven't been so good to me that I need bother my head about them." She pushed him away and, walking up to the box office, put down her money. Philip had 3d. in his pocket. He could not follow. He turned away and walked slowly down Oxford Street. "I can't do anything more," he said to himself. That was the end. He did not see her again. Chapter 110. Chapter 110. Christmas that year falling on Thursday, the shop was to close for 4 days. Philip wrote to his uncle asking whether it would be convenient for him to spend the holidays at the vicarage. He received an answer from Mrs. Foster saying that Mr. Carey was not well enough to write himself, but wished to see his nephew and would be glad if he came down. She met Philip at the door, and when she shook hands with him said, "You'll find him changed since you were here last, sir. But you'll pretend you don't notice anything, won't you, sir? He's that nervous about himself." Philip nodded, and she led him into the dining room. "Here's Mr. Philip, sir." The vicar of Blackstable was a dying man. There was no mistaking that when you looked at the hollow cheeks and the shrunken body. He sat huddled in the armchair with his head strangely thrown back and a shawl over his shoulders. He could not walk now without the help of sticks, and his hands trembled so that he could only feed himself with difficulty. "He can't last long now," thought Philip, as he looked at him. "How do you think I'm looking?" asked the Vicar. "Do you think I've changed since you were here last?" "I think you look stronger than you did last summer." "It was the heat. That always upsets me." Mr. Carey's history of the last few months consisted in the number of weeks he had spent in his bedroom and the number of weeks he had spent downstairs. He had a handbell by his side, and while he talked he rang it for Mrs. Foster, who sat in the next room ready to attend to his wants, to ask on what day of the month he had first left his room. "On the 7th of November, sir." Mr. Carey looked at Philip to see how he took the information. "But I eat well still, don't I, Mrs. Foster?" "Yes, sir, you've got a wonderful appetite." "I don't seem to put on flesh, though." Nothing interested him now but his health. He was set upon one thing indomitably, and that was living, just living, notwithstanding the monotony of his life and the constant pain which allowed him to sleep only when he was under the influence of morphia. "It's terrible the amount of money I have to spend on doctor's bills." He tinkled his bell again. "Mrs. Foster, show Master Philip the chemist's bill." Patiently she took it off the chimney piece and handed it to Philip. "That's only 1 month. I was wondering if as you're doctoring yourself you couldn't get me the drugs cheaper. I thought of getting them down from the stores, but then there's the postage." Though apparently taking so little interest in him that he did not trouble to inquire what Phil was doing, he seemed glad to have him there. He asked how long he could stay, and when Philip told him he must leave on Tuesday morning, expressed a wish that the visit might have been longer. He told him minutely all his symptoms and repeated what the doctor had said of him. He broke off to ring his bell, and when Mrs. Foster came in said, "Oh, I wasn't sure if you were there. I only rang to see if you were." When she had gone he explained to Philip that it made it uneasy if he was not certain that Mrs. Foster was within earshot. She knew exactly what to do with him if anything happened. Philip, seeing that she was tired and that her eyes were heavy from want of sleep, suggested that he was working her too hard. "Oh, nonsense," said the Vicar. "She's as strong as a horse." And when next she came in to give him his medicine, he said to her, "Master Philip says you've got too much to do, Mrs. Foster. You like looking after me, don't you?" "Oh, I don't mind, sir. I want to do everything I can." Presently the medicine took effect, and Mr. Carey fell asleep. Philip went into the kitchen and asked Mrs. Foster whether she could stand the work. He saw that for some months she had had little peace. "Well, sir, what can I do?" she answered. "The poor old gentleman's so dependent on me, and, although he is troublesome sometimes, you can't help liking him, can you? I've been here so many years now, I don't know what I shall do when he comes to go." Philip saw that she was really fond of the old man. She washed and dressed him, gave him his food, and was up half a dozen times in the night; for she slept in the next room to his, and whenever he awoke he tinkled his little bell till she came in. He might die at any moment, but he might live for months. It was wonderful that she should look after a stranger with such patient tenderness, and it was tragic and pitiful that she should be alone in the world to care for him. It seemed to Philip that the religion which his uncle had preached all his life was now of no more than formal importance to him. Every Sunday the curate came and administered to him Holy Communion, and he often read his Bible, but it was clear that he looked upon death with horror. He believed that it was the gateway to life everlasting, but he did not want to enter upon that life. In constant pain, chained to his chair, and having given up the hope of ever getting out into the open again, like a child in the hands of a woman to whom he paid wages, he clung to the world he knew. In Philip's head was a question he could not ask, because he was aware that his uncle would never give any but a conventional answer. He wondered whether at the very end, now that the machine was painfully wearing itself out, The clergyman still believed in immortality. Perhaps at the bottom of his soul, not allowed to shape itself into words in case it became urgent, was the conviction that there was no God, and after this life, nothing. On the evening of Boxing Day, Philip sat in the dining room with his uncle. He had to start very early next morning in order to get to the shop by 9, and he was to say good night to Mr. Carey then. The Vicar of Blackstable was dozing, and Philip, lying on the sofa by the window, let his book fall on his knees and looked idly round the room. He asked himself how much the furniture would fetch. He had walked round the house and looked at the things he had known from his childhood. There were a few pieces of china which might go for a decent price, and Philip wondered if it would be worth while to take them up to London. But the furniture was of the Victorian order, of mahogany, solid and ugly. It would go for nothing at an auction. There were 3,000 or 4,000 books, but everyone knew how badly they sold, and it was not probable that they would fetch more than £100. Philip did not know how much his uncle would leave, and he reckoned out for the 100th time what was the least sum upon which he could finish the curriculum at the hospital, take his degree, and live during the time he wished to spend on hospital appointments. He looked at the old man sleeping restlessly. There was no humanity left in that shrivelled face. It was the face of some queer animal. Philip thought how easy it would be to finish that useless life. He had thought it each evening when Mrs. Foster prepared for his uncle the medicine which was to give him an easy night. There were 2 bottles. One contained a drug which he took regularly, and the other an opiate if the pain grew unendurable. This was poured out for him and left by his bedside. He generally took it at 3 or 4 in the morning. It would be a simple thing to double the dose. He would die in the night, and no one would suspect anything. For that was how Dr. Wigram expected him to die. The end would be painless. Philip clenched his hands as he thought of the money he wanted so badly. A few more months of that wretched life could matter nothing to the old man, but the few more months meant everything to him. He was getting to the end of his endurance, and when he thought of going back to work in the morning, he shuddered with horror. His heart beat quickly at the thought which obsessed him, and though he made an effort to put it out of his mind, he could not. It would be so easy, so desperately easy. He had no feeling for the old man. He had never liked him. He had been selfish all his life, selfish to his wife who adored him, indifferent to the boy who had been put in his charge. He was not a cruel man, but a stupid, hard man, eaten up with a small sensuality. It would be easy, desperately easy. Philip did not dare. He was afraid of remorse. It would be no good having the money if he regretted all his life what he had done. Though he had told himself so often that regret was futile, there were certain things that came back to him occasionally and worried him. He wished they were not on his conscience. His uncle opened his eyes. Philip was glad, for he looked a little more human then. He was frankly horrified at the idea that had come to him. It was murder that he was meditating, and he wondered if other people had such thoughts, or whether he was abnormal and depraved. He supposed he could not have done it when it came to the point, but there the thought was, constantly recurring. If he held his hand it was from fear. His uncle spoke. "You're not looking forward to my death, Philip?" Philip felt his heart beat against his chest. "Good heavens, no." "That's a good boy. I shouldn't like you to do that. You'll get a little bit of money when I pass away, but you mustn't look forward to it. It wouldn't profit you if you did." He spoke in a low voice, and there was a curious anxiety in his tone. It sent a pang into Philip's heart. He wondered what strange insight might have led the old man to surmise what strange desires were in Philip's mind. "I hope you'll live for another 20 years," he said. "Oh, well, I can't expect to do that. But if I take care of myself, I don't see why I shouldn't last another 3 or 4. He was silent for a while, and Philip found nothing to say. Then, as if he had been thinking it all over, the old man spoke again. Everyone has the right to live as long as he can." Philip wanted to distract his mind. "By the way, I suppose you never hear from Miss Wilkinson now?" "Yes, I had a letter some time this year. She's married, you know." "Really?" "Yes, she's married a widower. I believe they're quite comfortable." Chapter 110 Of Human Bondage by W. Somerset Maugham. Chapter 111 Next day Philip began to work again, but the end which he had expected within a few weeks did not come. The weeks passed into months. The winter wore away, and in the parks the trees burst into bud and into leaf. A terrible lassitude settled upon Philip. Time was passing, though it went with such heavy feet, and he thought that his youth was going, and soon he would have lost it, and nothing would have been accomplished. His work seemed more aimless now that there was the certainty of his leaving it. He became skilful in the designing of costumes, and though he had no inventive faculty acquired quickness in the adaptation of French fashions to the English market. Sometimes he was not displeased with his drawings, but they always bungled them in the execution. He was amused to notice that he suffered from a lively irritation when his ideas were not adequately carried out. He had to walk warily. Whenever he suggested something original, Mr. Sampson turned it down. Their customers did not want anything outré. It was a very respectable class of business, and when you had a connection of that sort it wasn't worth while taking liberties with it. Once or twice he spoke sharply to Philip. He thought the young man was getting a bit above himself, because Philip's ideas did not always coincide with his own. "You jolly well take care, my fine young fellow, or one of these days you'll find yourself in the street." Philip longed to give him a punch on the nose, but he restrained himself. After all, it could not possibly last much longer, and then he would be done with all these people for ever. Sometimes in a comic desperation he cried out that his uncle must be made of iron. What a constitution! The ills he suffered from would have killed any decent person 12 months before. When at last the news came that the Vicar was dying, Philip, who had been thinking of other things, was taken by surprise. It was in July, and in another fortnight he was to have gone for his holiday. He received a letter from Mrs. Foster saying the doctor did not give Mr. Carey many days to live, and if Philip wished to see him again he must come at once. Philip went to the buyer and told him he wanted to leave. Mr. Sampson was a decent fellow, and when he knew the circumstances made no difficulties. Philip said good-bye to the people in his department. The reason of his leaving had spread among them in an exaggerated form, and they thought he had come into a fortune. Mrs. Hodges had tears in her eyes when she shook hands with him. "I s'pose we shan't often see you again," she said. "I'm glad to get away from Lynn's," he answered. It was strange, but he was actually sorry to leave these people whom he thought he had loathed, and when he drove away from the house in Harrington Street it was with no exultation. He had so anticipated the emotions he would experience on this occasion that now he felt nothing. He was as unconcerned as though he were going for a few days' holiday. "I've got a rotten nature," he said to himself. "I look forward to things awfully, and then when they come I'm always disappointed." He reached Blackstable early in the afternoon. Mrs. Foster met him at the door, and her face told him that his uncle was not yet dead. "He's a little better today," she said. "He's got a wonderful constitution." She led him into the bedroom where Mr. Carey lay on his back. He gave Philip a slight smile, in which was a trace of satisfied cunning at having circumvented his enemy once more. "I thought it was all up with me yesterday," he said, in an exhausted voice. "They'd all given me up, hadn't you, Mrs. Foster?" "You've got a wonderful constitution, there's no denying that." "There's life in the old dog yet." Mrs. Foster said that the Vicar must not talk, it would tire him. She treated him like a child with kindly despotism, and there was something childish in the old man's satisfaction at having cheated all their expectations. It struck him at once that Philip had been sent for, and he was amused that he had been brought on a fool's errand. If he could only avoid another of his heart attacks he would get well enough in a week or two. And he had had the attacks several times before. He always felt as if he were going to die, but he never did. They all talked of his constitution, but they none of them knew how strong it was. "Are you going to stay a day or two?" he asked Philip, pretending to believe he had come down for a holiday. "I was thinking of it," Philip answered cheerfully. "A breath of sea air will do you good." Presently Dr. Wigram came, and after he had seen the Vicar, talked with Philip. He adopted an appropriate manner. "I'm afraid it is the end this time, Philip," he said. "It'll be a great loss to all of us. I've known him for 35 years." "He seems well enough now," said Philip. "I'm keeping him alive on drugs, but it can't last. It was dreadful these last 2 days. I thought he was dead half a dozen times." The doctor was silent for a minute or two, but at the gate he said suddenly to Philip: "Has Mrs. Foster said anything to you?" "What do you mean?" "They're very superstitious, these people. She's got hold of an idea that he's got something on his mind, and he can't die till he gets rid of it, and he can't bring himself to confess it." Philip did not answer, and the doctor went on: "Of course it's nonsense. He's led a very good life, he's done his duty, and he's been a good parish priest, and I'm sure we shall all miss him. He can't have anything to reproach himself with. I very much doubt whether the next vicar will suit us half so well." For several days Mr. Carey continued without change. His appetite, which had been excellent, left him, and he could eat little. Dr. Wigram did not hesitate now to still the pain of the neuritis which tormented him, and that, with the constant shaking of his palsied limbs, was gradually exhausting him. His mind remained clear. Philip and Mrs. Foster nursed him between them. She was so tired by the many months during which she had been attentive to all his wants that Philip insisted on sitting up with the patient so that she might have her night's rest. He passed the long hours in an armchair so that he should not sleep soundly, and read by the light of shaded candles the 1001 Nights. He had not read them since he was a little boy, and they brought back his childhood to him. Sometimes he sat and listened to the silence of the night. When the effects of the opiate wore off, Mr. Carey grew restless and kept him constantly busy. At last, early one morning, when the birds were chattering noisily in the trees, he heard his name called. He went up to the bed. Mr. Carey was lying on his back, with his eyes looking at the ceiling. He did not turn them on Philip. Philip saw that sweat was on his forehead, and he took a towel and wiped it. "Is that you, Philip?" the old man asked. Philip was startled because the voice was suddenly changed. It was hoarse and low. So would a man speak if he was cold with fear. "Yes, do you want anything?" There was a pause, and still the unseeing eyes stared at the ceiling. Then a twitch passed over the face. "I think I'm going to die," he said. "Oh, what nonsense!" cried Philip. "You're not going to die for years." 2 tears were wrung from the old man's eyes. They moved Philip horribly. His uncle had never betrayed any particular emotion in the affairs of life, and it was dreadful to see them now, for they signified a terror that was unspeakable. "Send for Mr. Simmonds," he said. "I want to take the communion." Mr. Simmonds was the curate. "Now?" asked Philip. "Soon, or else it'll be too late." Philip went to awake Mrs. Foster, but it was later than he thought, and she was up already. He told her to send the gardener with a message, and he went back to his uncle's room. "Have you sent for Mr. Simmonds?" "Yes." There was a silence. Philip sat by the bedside and occasionally wiped the sweating forehead. "Let me hold your hand, Philip," the old man said at last. Philip gave him his hand, and he clung to it as to life, for comfort in his extremity. Perhaps he had never really loved anyone in all his days, but now he turned instinctively to a human being. His hand was wet and cold. It grasped Philip's with feeble, despairing energy. The old man was fighting with the fear of death, and Philip thought that all must go through that. Oh, how monstrous it was, and they could believe in a God that allowed his creatures to suffer such a cruel torture. He had never cared for his uncle, and for 2 years he had longed every day for his death, but now he could not overcome the compassion that filled his heart. What a price it was to pay for being other than the beasts. They remained in silence, broken only once by a low inquiry from Mr. Carey. "Hasn't he come yet?" At last the housekeeper came in softly to say that Mr. Simmonds was there. He carried a bag in which were his surplice and his hood. Mrs. Foster brought the communion plate. Mr. Simmonds shook hands silently with Philip, and then with professional gravity went to the sick man's side. Philip and the maid went out of the room. Philip walked round the garden, all fresh and dewy in the morning. The birds were singing gaily. The sky was blue, but the air, salt laden, was sweet and cool. The roses were in full bloom. The green of the trees, the green of the lawns, was eager and brilliant. Philip walked, and as he walked he thought of the mystery which was proceeding in that bedroom. It gave him a peculiar emotion. Presently Mrs. Foster came out to him and said that his uncle wished to see him. The curate was putting his things back into the black bag. The sick man turned his head a little and greeted him with a smile. Philip was astonished, for there was a change in him, an extraordinary change. His eyes had no longer the terror-stricken look, and the pinching of his face had gone. He looked happy and serene. "I'm quite prepared now," he said, and his voice had a different tone in it. "When the Lord sees fit to call me, I am ready to give my soul into his hands." Philip did not speak. He could see that his uncle was sincere. It was almost a miracle. He had taken the body and blood of his Saviour, and they had given him strength so that he no longer feared the inevitable passage into the night. He knew he was going to die. He was resigned. He only said one more thing: "I shall rejoin my dear wife." It startled Philip. He remembered with what a callous selfishness his uncle had treated her, how obtuse he had been to her humble, devoted love. The curate, deeply moved, went away, and Mrs. Foster, weeping, accompanied him to the door. Mr. Carey, exhausted by his effort, fell into a light doze, and Philip sat down by the bed and waited for the end. The morning wore on, and the old man's breathing grew stertorous. The doctor came and said he was dying. He was unconscious, and he pecked feebly at the sheets. He was restless, and he cried out. Dr. Wigram gave him a hypodermic injection. "It can't do any good now. He may die at any moment." The doctor looked at his watch and then at the patient. Philip saw that it was 1 o'clock. Dr. Wigram was thinking of his dinner. "It's no use your waiting," he said. "There's nothing I can do," said the doctor. When he was gone, Mrs. Foster asked Philip if he would go to the carpenter, who was also the undertaker, and tell him to send up a woman to lay out the body. "You want a little fresh air," she said. "It'll do you good." The undertaker lived half a mile away. When Philip gave him his message he said: "When did the poor old gentleman die?" Philip hesitated. It occurred to him that it would seem brutal to fetch a woman to wash the body while his uncle still lived, and he wondered why Mrs. Foster had asked him to come. They would think he was in a great hurry to kill the old man off. He thought the undertaker looked at him oddly. He repeated the question. It irritated Philip. It was no business of his. When did the vicar pass away? Philip's first impulse was to say that it had just happened, but then it would seem inexplicable if the sick man lingered for several hours. He reddened and answered awkwardly: "Oh, he isn't exactly dead yet." The undertaker looked at him in perplexity, and he hurried to explain. "Mrs. Foster is all alone, and she wants a woman there. You understand, don't you? He may be dead by now." The undertaker nodded. "Oh, yes, I see. I'll send someone up at once." When Philip got back to the vicarage, he went up to the bedroom. Mrs. Foster rose from her chair by the bedside. "He's just as he was when you left," she said. She went down to get herself something to eat, and Philip watched curiously the process of death. There was nothing human now in the unconscious being that struggled feebly. Sometimes a muttered ejaculation issued from the loose mouth. The sun beat down hotly from a cloudless sky, but the trees in the garden were pleasant and cool. It was a lovely day. A bluebottle buzzed against the window pane. Suddenly there was a loud rattle. It made Philip start. It was horribly frightening. A movement passed through the limbs, and the old man was dead. The machine had run down. The bluebottle buzzed noisily against the window pane. Chapter 111. Chapter 112. Josiah Graves in his masterful way made arrangements, becoming but economical, for the funeral, and when it was over came back to the vicarage with Philip. The will was in his charge, and with a due sense of the fitness of things he read it to Philip over an early cup of tea. It was written on half a sheet of paper and left everything Mr. Carey had to his nephew. There was the furniture, about £80 at the bank, 20 shares in the ABC Company, a few in Allsopp's brewery, some in the Oxford Music Hall, and a few more in a London restaurant. They had been bought under Mr. Graves' direction, and he told Philip with satisfaction: "You see, people must eat, they will drink, and they want amusement. You're always safe if you put your money in what the public thinks necessities." His words showed a nice discrimination between the grossness of the vulgar, which he deplored but accepted, and the finer taste of the elect. Altogether in investments there was about £500, and to that must be added the balance at the bank and what the furniture would fetch. It was riches to Philip. He was not happy, but infinitely relieved. Mr. Graves left him after they had discussed the auction which must be held as soon as possible, and Philip sat himself down to go through the papers of the deceased. The Reverend William Carey had prided himself on never destroying anything, and there were piles of correspondence dating back for 50 years, and bundles upon bundles of neatly docketed bills. He had kept not only letters addressed to him, but letters which himself had written. There was a yellow packet of letters which he had written to his father in the 40s, when, as an Oxford undergraduate, he had gone to Germany for the long vacation. Philip read them idly. It was a different William Carey from the William Carey he had known, and yet there were traces in the boy which might, to an acute observer, have suggested the man. The letters were formal and a little stilted. He showed himself strenuous to see all that was noteworthy, and he described with a fine enthusiasm the castles of the Rhine. The falls of Schaffhausen made him offer reverent thanks to the all-powerful Creator of the universe, whose works were wondrous and beautiful, and he could not help thinking that they who lived in sight of this handiwork of their blessed Maker must be moved by the contemplation to lead pure and holy lives. Among some bills Philip found a miniature which had been painted of William Carey soon after he was ordained. It represented a thin young curate, with long hair that fell over his head in natural curls, with dark eyes, large and dreamy, and a pale, ascetic face. Philip remembered the chuckle with which his uncle used to tell him of the dozens of slippers which were worked for him by adoring ladies. The rest of the afternoon and all the evening Philip toiled through the innumerable correspondence. He glanced at the address and at the signature, then tore the letter in two and threw it into the washing basket by his side. Suddenly he came upon one signed Helen. He did not know the writing. It was thin, angular, and old-fashioned. It began, "My dear William," and ended, "Your affectionate sister." Then it struck him that it was from his own mother. He had never seen a letter of hers before, and her handwriting was strange to him. It was about himself. "My dear William, Stephen wrote to you to thank you for your congratulations on the birth of our son and your kind wishes to myself. Thank God we are both well, and I am deeply thankful for the great mercy which has been shown me. Now that I can hold a pen, I want to tell you and dear Louisa myself how truly grateful I am to you both for all your kindness to me now and always since my marriage. I am going to ask you to do me a great favour. Both Stephen and I wish you to be the boy's godfather, and we hope that you will consent. I know I am not asking a small thing, for I am sure you will take the responsibilities of the position very seriously,
but I am especially anxious that you should undertake this office, because you are a clergyman as well as the boy's uncle. I am very anxious for the boy's welfare, and I pray God night and day that he may grow into a good, honest, and Christian man. With you to guide him, I hope that he will become a soldier in Christ's faith, and be all the days of his life God-fearing, humble, and pious. Your affectionate sister, Helen.
Philip pushed the letter away and, leaning forward, rested his face on his hands. It deeply touched and at the same time surprised him. He was astonished at its religious tone, which seemed to him neither mawkish nor sentimental. He knew nothing of his mother, dead now for nearly 20 years, but that she was beautiful, and it was strange to learn that she was simple and pious. He never thought of that side of her. He read again what she said about him, what she expected and thought about him. He had turned out very differently. He looked at himself for a moment. Perhaps it was better that she was dead. Then a sudden impulse caused him to tear up the letter. Its tenderness and simplicity made it seem peculiarly private. He had a queer feeling that there was something indecent in his reading what exposed his mother's gentle soul. He went on with the Vicar's dreary correspondence. A few days later he went up to London, and for the first time for 2 years entered by day the hall of St. Luke's Hospital. He went to see the secretary of the medical school. He was surprised to see him, and asked Philip curiously what he had been doing. Philip's experiences had given him a certain confidence in himself and a different outlook upon many things. Such a question would have embarrassed him before, but now he answered coolly, with a deliberate vagueness which prevented further inquiry, that private affairs had obliged him to make a break in the curriculum. He was now anxious to qualify as soon as possible. The first examination he could take was in midwifery and the diseases of women, and he put his name down to be a clerk in the ward devoted to feminine ailments. Since it was holiday time, there happened to be no difficulty in getting a post as obstetric clerk. He arranged to undertake that duty during the last week of August and the first 2 of September. After this interview, Philip walked through the medical school, more or less deserted, for the examinations at the end of the summer session were all over, and he wandered along the terrace by the riverside. His heart was full. He thought that now he could begin a new life, and he would put behind him all the errors, follies, and miseries of the past. The flowing river suggested that everything past was passing always, and nothing mattered. The future was before him, rich with possibilities. He went back to Blackstable and busied himself with the setting up of his uncle's estate. The auction was fixed for the middle of August, when the presence of visitors for the summer holidays would make it possible to get better prices. Catalogues were made out and sent to the various dealers in second-hand books at Tercanbury, Maidstone, and Ashford. One afternoon Philip took it into his head to go over to Tercanbury and see his old school. He had not been there since the day when, with relief in his heart, he had left it with the feeling that thenceforward he was his own master. It was strange to wander through the narrow streets of Tercanbury, which he had known so well for many years. He looked at the old shops still there, still selling the same things: the booksellers with school books, highest works, and the latest novels in one window, and photographs of the cathedral and of the city in the other; the game shop with its cricket bats, fishing tackle, tennis rackets, and footballs; the tailor from whom he had got clothes all through his boyhood, and the fishmonger where his uncle, whenever he came to Tercanbury, bought fish. He wandered along the sordid street in which, behind a high wall, lay the red brick house which was the preparatory school. Further on was the gateway that led into King's School, and he stood in the quadrangle round which were the various buildings. It was just 4, and the boys were hurrying out of school. He saw the masters in their gowns and mortar boards, and they were strange to him. It was more than 10 years since he had left, and many changes had taken place. He saw the headmaster. He walked slowly down from the schoolhouse to his own,
talking to a big boy who Philip supposed was in the sixth. He was little changed, tall, cadaverous, romantic as Philip remembered him, with the same wild eyes; but the black beard was streaked with gray now, and the dark sallow face was more deeply lined. Philip had an impulse to go up and speak to him, but he was afraid he would have forgotten him, and he hated the thought of explaining who he was. Boys lingered talking to one another, and presently some who had hurried to change came out to play fives. Others straggled out in twos and threes and went out of the gateway. Philip knew they were going up to the cricket ground. Others again went into the precincts to bat at the nets. Philip stood among them a stranger. One or two gave him an indifferent glance, but visitors attracted by the Norman staircase were not rare and excited little attention. Philip looked at them curiously. He thought with melancholy of the distance that separated him from them, and he thought bitterly how much he had wanted to do and how little done. It seemed to him that all those years, vanished beyond recall, had been utterly wasted. The boys, fresh and buoyant, were doing the same things that he had done. It seemed that not a day had passed since he left the school, and yet in that place where at least by name he had known everybody, now he knew not a soul. In a few years these two, others taking their place, would stand alien as he stood. But the reflection brought him no solace. It merely impressed upon him the futility of human existence. Each generation repeated the trivial round. He wondered what had become of the boys who were his companions. They were nearly 30 now. Some would be dead, but others were married and had children. They were soldiers and parsons, doctors, lawyers. They were staid men who were beginning to put youth behind them. Had any of them made such a hash of life as he? He thought of the boy he had been devoted to. It was funny, he could not recall his name. He remembered exactly what he looked like, he had been his greatest friend, but his name would not come back to him. He looked back with amusement on the jealous emotions he had suffered on his account. It was irritating not to recollect his name. He longed to be a boy again, like those he saw sauntering through the quadrangle, so that, avoiding his mistakes, he might start fresh and make something more out of life. He felt an intolerable loneliness. He almost regretted the penury which he had suffered during the last 2 years, since the desperate struggle merely to keep body and soul together had deadened the pain of living. In the sweat of thy brow shalt thou earn thy daily bread. It was not a curse upon mankind, but the balm which reconciled it to existence. But Philip was impatient with himself. He called to mind his idea of the pattern of life. The unhappiness he had suffered was no more than part of a decoration which was elaborate and beautiful. He told himself strenuously that he must accept with gaiety everything, dreariness and excitement, pleasure and pain, because it added to the richness of the design. He sought for beauty consciously, and he remembered how even as a boy he had taken pleasure in the Gothic cathedral as one saw it from the precincts. He went there and looked at the massive pile, gray under the cloudy sky, with the central tower that rose like the praise of men to their god. But the boys were batting at the nets, and they were lissom and strong and active. He could not help hearing their shouts and laughter. The cry of youth was insistent, and he saw the beautiful thing before him only with his eyes. Chapter 112. Chapter 113. At the beginning of the last week in August, Philip entered upon his duties in the district. They were arduous, for he had to attend an average of 3 confinements a day. The patient had obtained a card from the hospital some time before, and when her time came it was taken to the porter by a messenger, generally a little girl, who was then sent across the road to the house in which Philip lodged. At night the porter, who had a latch key, himself came over and awoke Philip. It was mysterious then to get up in the darkness and walk through the deserted streets of the South Side. At those hours it was generally the husband who brought the card. If there had been a number of babies before, he took it for the most part with surly indifference, but if newly married he was nervous and then sometimes strove to allay his anxiety by getting drunk. Often there was a mile or more to walk, during which Philip and the messenger discussed the conditions of labor and the costs of living. Philip learnt about the various trades which were practised on that side of the river. He inspired confidence in the people among whom he was thrown, and during the long hours that he waited in a stuffy room, the woman in labor lying on a large bed that took up half of it, her mother and the midwife talked to him as naturally as they talked to one another. The circumstances in which he had lived during the last 2 years had taught him several things about the life of the very poor, which it amused them to find he knew, and they were impressed because he was not deceived by their little subterfuges. He was kind, and he had gentle hands, and he did not lose his temper. They were pleased because he was not above drinking a cup of tea with them, and when the dawn came and they were still waiting, they offered him a slice of bread and dripping. He was not squeamish and could eat most things now with a good appetite. Some of the houses he went to, in filthy courts off a dingy street, huddled against one another without light or air, were merely squalid, but others, unexpectedly, though dilapidated, with worm-eaten floors and leaking roofs, had the grand air. You found in them oak balusters exquisitely carved, and the walls had still their panelling. These were thickly inhabited. One family lived in each room, and in the daytime there was the incessant noise of children playing in the court. The old walls were the breeding place of vermin. The air was so foul that often, feeling sick, Philip had to light his pipe. The people who dwelt here lived from hand to mouth. Babies were unwelcome. The man received them with surly anger, the mother with despair. It was one more mouth to feed, and there was little enough wherewith to feed those already there. Philip often discerned the wish that the child might be born dead or might die quickly. He delivered one woman of twins, a source of humour to the facetious, and when she was told she burst into a long, shrill wail of misery. Her mother said outright, "I don't know how they're going to feed 'em." "Maybe the Lord'll see fit to take 'em to himself," said the midwife. Philip caught sight of the husband's face as he looked at the tiny pair lying side by side, and there was a ferocious sullenness in it which startled him. He felt in the family assembled there was a hideous resentment against those poor atoms who had come into the world unwished for, and he had a suspicion that if he did not speak firmly an accident would occur. Accidents occurred often. Mothers overlaid their babies, and perhaps errors of diet were not always the result of carelessness. "I shall come every day," he said. "I warn you that if anything happens to them there'll have to be an inquest." The father made no reply, but he gave Philip a scowl. There was murder in his soul. "Bless their little 'earts," said the grandmother. "What should 'appen to them?" The great difficulty was to keep the mothers in bed for 10 days, which was the minimum upon which the hospital practice insisted. It was awkward to look after the family, no one would see to the children without payment, and the husband tumbled because his tea was not right when he came home tired from his work and hungry. Philip had heard that the poor helped one another, but woman after woman complained to him that she could not get anyone in to clean up and see to the children's dinner without paying for the service, and she could not afford to pay. By listening to the women as they talked, and by chance remarks from which he could deduce much that was left unsaid, Philip learned how little there was in common between the poor and the classes above them. They did not envy their betters, for the life was too different, and they had an ideal of ease which made the existence of the middle classes seem formal and stiff. Moreover, they had a certain contempt for them because they were soft and did not work with their hands. The proud merely wished to be left alone, but the majority looked upon the well-to-do as people to be exploited. They knew what to say in order to get such advantages as the charitable put at their disposal, and they accepted benefits as a right which came to them from the folly of their superiors and their own astuteness. They bore the curate with contemptuous indifference, but the district visitor excited their bitter hatred. She came in and opened your windows without so much as a by your leave or with your leave, And me with my bronchitis enough to give me my death of cold. She poked her nose into corners, and if she didn't say the place was dirty, you saw what she thought, right enough. And it's all very well for them as 'as servants, but I'd like to see what she'd make of her own room if she 'ad 4 children and 'ad to do the cooking and mend their clothes and wash them." Philip discovered that the greatest tragedy of life to these people was not separation or death, that was natural, and the grief of it could be assuaged with tears, but loss of work. He saw a man come home one afternoon, 3 days after his wife's confinement, and tell her he had been dismissed. He was a builder, and at that time work was slack. He stated the fact and sat down to his tea. "Oh, Jim," she said. The man ate stolidly some mess which had been stewing in a saucepan against his coming. He stared at his plate. His wife looked at him 2 or 3 times with little startled glances, and then quite suddenly began to cry. The builder was an uncouth little fellow with a rough, weather-beaten face and a long, white scar on his forehead. He had large, stubbly hands. Presently he pushed aside his plate, as if he must give up the effort to force himself to eat, and turned a fixed gaze out of the window. The room was at the top of the house, at the back, and one saw nothing but sullen clouds. The silence seemed heavy with despair. Philip felt that there was nothing to be said, he could only go. And as he walked away wearily, for he had been up most of the night, his heart was filled with rage against the cruelty of the world. He knew the hopelessness of the search for work, and the desolation which is harder to bear than hunger. He was thankful not to have to believe in God, for then such a condition of things would be intolerable. One could reconcile oneself to existence only because it was meaningless. It seemed to Philip that the people who spent their time in helping the poorer classes erred because they sought to remedy things which would harass them if themselves had to endure them without thinking that they did not in the least disturb those who were used to them. The poor did not want large, airy rooms. They suffered from cold, for their food was not nourishing and their circulation bad. Space gave them a feeling of chilliness, and they wanted to burn as little coal as need be. There was no hardship for several to sleep in one room. They preferred it. They were never alone for a moment from the time they were born till the time they died, and loneliness oppressed them. They enjoyed the promiscuity in which they dealt, and the constant noise of their surroundings pressed upon their ears unnoticed. They did not feel the need of taking a bath constantly, and Philip often heard them speak with indignation of the necessity to do so with which they were faced on entering the hospital. It was both an affront and a discomfort. They wanted chiefly to be left alone. Then, if the man was in regular work, life went easily and was not without its pleasures. There was plenty of time for gossip. After the day's work a glass of beer was very good to drink. The streets were a constant source of entertainment. If you wanted to read, there was Reynolds or the News of the World. But there, you couldn't make out 'ow the time did fly. The truth was, and that's a fact, you was a rare one for reading when you was a girl, but what with one thing and another you didn't get no time now, not even to read the paper. The usual practice was to pay 3 visits after a confinement, and one Sunday Philip went to see a patient at the dinner hour. She was up for the first time. "I couldn't stay in bed no longer, I really couldn't. I'm not one for idling, and it gives me the fidgets to be there and do nothing all day long, so I said to 'Erb, 'I'm just going to get up and cook your dinner for you.'" 'Erb was sitting at table with his knife and fork already in his hands. He was a young man with an open face and blue eyes. He was earning good money, and as things went the couple were in easy circumstances. They had only been married a few months, and were both delighted with the rosy boy who lay in the cradle at the foot of the bed. There was a savoury smell of beefsteak in the room, and Philip's eyes turned to the range. "I was just going to dish up this minute," said the woman. "Fire away," said Philip. "I'll just have a look at the sun and air, and then I'll take myself off." Husband and wife laughed at Philip's expression, and 'Erb, getting up, went over with Philip to the cradle. He looked at his baby proudly. "There doesn't seem much wrong with him, does there?" said Philip. He took up his hat, and by this time 'Erb's wife had dished up the beefsteak and put on the table a plate of green peas. "You're going to have a nice dinner," smiled Philip. "He's only in of a Sunday, and I like to have something special for him, so as he shall miss his own when he's out at work." "I suppose you'd be above sitting down and 'aving a bit of dinner with us?" said 'Erb. "Oh, 'Erb," said his wife, in a shocked tone. "Not if you ask me," answered Philip, with his attractive smile. "Well, that's just what I call friendly. I knew he wouldn't take no offence, Polly. Just get another plate, my girl." Polly was flustered, and she thought 'Erb a regular caution. You never knew what eyes he'd get in his 'ead next. But she got a plate, and wiped it quickly with her apron, then took a new knife and fork from the chest of drawers, where her best cutlery rested among her best clothes. There was a jug of stout on the table, and 'Erb poured Philip out a glass. He wanted to give him the lion's share of the beefsteak, but Philip insisted that they should share alike. It was a sunny room with two windows that reached to the floor. It had been the parlour of a house which at one time was, if not fashionable, at least respectable. It might have been inhabited 50 years before by a well-to-do tradesman, or by an officer on half pay. 'Erb had been a football player before he married, and there were photographs on the wall of various teams in self-conscious attitudes, with neatly plastered hair, the captain seated proudly in the middle holding a cup. There were other signs of prosperity, photographs of the relations of 'Erb and his wife in Sunday clothes, on the chimney-piece an elaborate arrangement of shells stuck on a miniature rock, and on each side mugs, a present from Southend in Gothic letters, with pictures of a pier and a parade on them. 'Erb was something of a character. He was a non-union man, and expressed himself with indignation at the efforts of the union to force him to join. The union wasn't no good to him, he never found no difficulty in getting work, and there was good wages for anyone as 'ad a head on his shoulders and wasn't above putting 'is 'and to anything as come his way. Polly was timorous. If she was 'im, she'd join the union. The last time there was a strike she was expecting 'im to be brought back in an ambulance every time he went out. She turned to Philip. "He's that obstinate, there's no doing anything with him." "Well, what I say is, it's a free country and I won't be dictated to." "It's no good saying it's a free country," said Polly. "That won't prevent 'em bashing your 'ead in if they get the chanst." When they had finished, Philip passed his pouch over to 'Erb, and they lit their pipes. Then he got up, for a call might be waiting for him at his rooms, and shook hands. He saw that it had given them pleasure that he shared their meal, and they saw that he had thoroughly enjoyed it. "Well, good bye, sir," said 'Erb, "and I 'ope we shall 'ave as nice a doctor next time the missus disgraces herself." "Go on with you, 'Erb," she retorted. "How d'you know there's going to be a next time?" Chapter 113.